both his proclamations. I'll quote a letter he wrote to Colonel Spalding, asking him to accept the colonel's commission in the Jacobite army, and saying these words: "Whether the king lands or not, our aim is to march south, break the Union, and restore the dignity of Scotland."
Hi, and welcome to And If Love Remains. I am your host, Mike Levitt, and today I am very excited to be speaking with Professor Murray Pittock. This is a man that's uniquely qualified to share the subject that we're going to deal with today, which is the Jacobites of the 17th and 18th centuries. Professor Pittock is currently Pro-Vice Principal at the University of Glasgow. Among his 93 writings and 18-ish books are his latest book, Enlightenment in a Smart City, Edinburgh's Civic Development, 1660 through 1750, as well as the book Culloden, and which will be especially useful in our discussion today. So welcome to the show, Murray. Thanks for being on.
Great to join you, Mike, today.
Wonderful. Well, I want to start here. I want to start a little bit with your history with Jacobitism, and why did you decide to devote much of your personal or professional work on this history?
Right. Well, I grew up from Aberdeen in the northeast of Scotland, and that was a Jacobite heartland in the 18th century. I'm not claiming it was a Jacobite heartland in the late 20th or anything like it, but it still was a very different place. And as growing up with a powerful interest in history, I engaged with the culture there. And later on, I became aware of just how important the Jacobite cause had been to determining not only the kind of state that Great Britain became, but the kind of world in which we live in, because ultimately it was a challenge to the kind of state we live in today in the UK, and also through that, a challenge to the kind of world that developed, and maybe even including the North American world, and we might come to that.
Yeah, for sure. It's interesting as I've done, as I mentioned to you before, I'm kind of a neophyte to this subject, but it's absolutely grasped me. And I've found that a lot of scholars who talk about the Jacobites seem to frame the history as maybe England bringing civilization to Scotland, or something along those lines, where you seem to definitely understand the cause from the Jacobites' perspective. So are you just kind of a professional iconoclast, or what's your what's your take on how maybe many scholars look at that history?
Well, I'm not an iconoclast, I would say. What I would say is that I smelt from an early age the absence of evidence in a great deal of Jacobite history. A lot of it was quite simple repetition of what people had written before, and often containing remarks about the Jacobites and about those who fought for them, which were prejudicial and discriminatory in a way which we wouldn't now, in non-historical time, happily see applied to any group of people. The idea, for example, that the Jacobites were supported by Highland savages continued to be published in respectable histories until the 1970s, even using terms like that. So I was aware from a pretty early age both that the framing of the Jacobite episode was highly prejudicial, and also that it didn't actually depend on any evidence. And from the book that I'm working on now, the study of the British Army occupation of Scotland in the years after 1746, there's just one example. There's a huge amount of evidence. There's evidence from court proceedings. There's evidence from presbyteries and synod meetings of the Church of Scotland. There's evidence of Chelsea pensioners. There's evidence of court martials. There's evidence of British Army postings. There's a huge amount of material, and currently there isn't even a single article written on that anywhere.
Wow.
So it's the neglect of what is actually there in the archive is staggering.
That is staggering, and it is such. Maybe that's one of the many reasons why I find it so interesting, because there isn't a whole lot there, other than stories and songs and poems and kind of folk tales, if you will, and I think. There's so much romanticism about it that I think sometimes we forget that, or maybe I don't think about the real people that are involved there, and to me it feels almost like a less about kingly succession than about a populist uprising. But before we get there, because we're kind of getting to the murky history a little bit, and I want to kind of plant ourselves in today, because I'm here in Arizona. When I think of Scotland, I think of its own country. I think of, it's got its own borders, its own parliament, and yet it's part of the Great Britain. And I'm curious, I just don't know, how does, what's the relationship between England and Scotland currently today, and how do they work together or don't work together maybe?
Well, that's a very big question. So in Scotland now for 14 years, the nationalists have been in power in the Scottish Parliament, and in the last general election across the United Kingdom, the Scottish National Party won 48 of the 59 seats in Scotland. So all the other British parties together have 11 seats in the Westminster Parliament, and the Scottish National Party is 48. Okay. So this is a situation which is very unfamiliar, I think, in the world of US politics, but it clearly indicates that Scotland and England today, although they remain part of a single state, are on very different trajectories, very different directions. Right. And that was underlined by the European vote, a Brexit vote in 2016, where every single one of Scotland's 32 local authorities voted to remain in the EU. And of course, Scotland ended up leaving the EU because ultimately that was a statewide, a UK-wide vote.
Okay. Well, and why? And again, this is probably another kind of overbroad, big question, but take a step back into history now, and why does England feel like it has a claim on Scotland, or that Scotland should be subordinate to England? Because that's the feeling that I get is that that's the relationship it should be.
Well,
according to England, I should say.
Yes. This takes us right back to the Jacobite period. So one of the fundamental reasons why Jacobitism remained a military and political threat to the new British state for so long after the senior Stuart heir, James VII of Scotland and II of England, was deposed in early 1689, is because it represented a different kind of state, a different kind of politics altogether. So the late Stuarts, Charles II and James, they ruled what is called a composite monarchy, a bit like Austria-Hungary or the Commonwealth of Poland, Lithuania, or what used to be the United Kingdom of the Netherlands when Belgium was included in it. Not a very familiar kind of state nowadays, but a state where there's one monarch, but they're different countries. And so there were separate parliaments and separate administrations in Dublin and Edinburgh and in London. And when James was deposed, and he was deposed by both the English and somewhat later the Scottish parliaments, one of the things that occurred after that was there was a very, very marked attempt to centralize power in London, and the union between England and Scotland came in, which was in 1707, united the two different states into a single state, the United Kingdoms of Great Britain. And that occurred because the Crown, Queen Anne, and politicians in Westminster, in London, were very keen to stop the Scottish Parliament potentially inviting the Stuarts back, because the Act of Settlement in 1701, which was an English parliamentary act, had excluded Catholics, all Catholics, from the throne for all time coming, including all the Stuart heirs. But the Scottish Parliament had refused to endorse the English Act of Settlement, and there was a fear that the Scottish Parliament would bring back the Stuarts. And to avoid that, one of the ways of avoiding that was to create a union between England and Scotland, and that's what happened in 1707.
Okay, so I know often, especially politics at that time, there is a large religious component to it. How did that? What was the environment of the people? I mean, what did the people think? Yeah, as the king was being deposed, what I guess through history, kings are deposed and royalty changes and things of that nature. But this seems to be something different from the people's standpoint. What was maybe different about this particular one?
Well, the difference was that it changed the nature of the state. So in Scotland, after the Union, there were far more supporters of the Jacobites than there had been before, because the Jacobites were committed to ending the Union. And in Ireland, the Jacobites received strong support throughout, because James's Parliament in Dublin in 1689, after he'd been deposed in England and Scotland, he had a Parliament in Dublin, and his army fought for 2 years in Ireland. And of course, the battles of the Boyne and Aughrim are famous to try and prevent William of Orange taking Ireland over. But James's Parliament in Dublin endorsed a restitution of the lands they'd lost to many Catholic noblemen who'd been dispossessed by particularly the Cromwellian regime in the middle of the 17th century. And so James and the Stuarts always received significant support from Catholic Ireland, and both Scotland and Ireland sent soldiers abroad to join regiments in the French and other services. And the French, the Irish brigades, and the Scottish regiments in the service of France were both deployed by the French army and the French government and crown, with a view to their being used to effect a Stuart restoration, as it were, France's military contribution to a Stuart restoration. And they were so used, particularly in the Rising of 1745.
Okay. And you talk. I saw one of your presentations, and one of the things you talked about were, some of the symbolism that went around Jacobites, and where people would pass medals around. And one thing that was especially interesting to me was that were these gloves. Before I get there, let me ask you this: Why was that so important for people to have kind of these different symbols? Songs, things of that nature to show their support for Jacobitism.
Well, I think one of the interesting things about Jacobitism as a political movement and the place it occupied in historical time was that the first age of mass production had just started. So milled coinage was introduced in England and Scotland in 1662. So mass production of coinage rather than being hammered. And there was a mass production of glass became possible from the 1670s, and various techniques improved the ability to make ceramics and other pottery in the 1670s. And so this is the first stage of mass production, if you like. So when the Stuarts lose their throne, part of their propaganda effort is to distribute sometimes very large quantities of medals or prints with their image on it and with a slogan or a political program on the other side of the medal to support their cause. So the medals were used extensively as a kind of modern form of an ancient form, if you like, of mass media. One of the reasons that medals were a bit dangerous, one of the reasons that people used songs was that all the treason legislation passed by England and English treason legislation was extended to Scotland after 1708. All the treason legislation passed by England, which went back to the reign of Edward III in the 14th century, depended on speaking or writing. So that if you hummed a tune or if you wore tartan, although they changed the tartan bit after 1746, then you couldn't be prosecuted because you weren't actually saying anything treasonable. Right. You were just displaying it, but you weren't actually saying anything. So that was really important, the ability to show and tell, but not to say anything that might land you in prison or even worse with a death sentence.
Right. Interesting. And that kind of takes me to the Liberty Gloves. And the reason why that intrigues me is I try not to impose my 21st century, ideas and what has come to me over time onto the Jacobites. Obviously, it's thousands of miles away in a different century. But I'm curious, what did liberty mean to the Jacobites, especially in they're looking for a certain king. Was it about self-governance, or what did that mean to them?
What it meant was to have a Scottish Parliament re-established in Edinburgh, dealing with Scottish affairs, to have not the Catholic but the Episcopalian Church re-established in Scotland, and to have a monarchy that listened to them, and that, if not, you couldn't really call the Jameses Scottish anymore by that stage, but had their origins in Scotland and a sympathy with Scotland. So liberty was and the liberty was also the ability to have a degree of political self-determination, though it's not exactly like modern nationalism. I don't know if your listeners are familiar with Senator Trent Lott's Senate Motion 155 which gave rise to Tartan Week in 1998, based on the Declaration of Arbroath. But the liberty, which no one loses except with life itself, which is a quotation from the Declaration of Arbroath, is just possibly the source of the ultimate source of the Liberty Gloves, which first appeared in Edinburgh in 1713. But liberty was usually embroidered in gold on the inside of the hand. So once again, these couldn't be seen, though they could be shown to sympathetic figures. And the colour white also symbolised Stuart sympathies. So the colour itself was beyond prosecution. These are very interesting times. But the other thing I should say about liberty is that there was a real fear, because after 1714, the British Crown came from the electorate of Hanover, that there was a real fear that Hanoverian and German interests would actually usurp Scottish ones. And I think, if I could make a reference there once again to American experience, the ability of the British Crown to utilize the Hessians in the American War of Independence came ultimately from the fact that the British Crown still included Hanover at that point. Right.
That is interesting, and that's a great connection. And so we have King James was it King James VI that was deposed, or King James VII?
Seventh of Scotland, second of England.
Second of England. Okay, and yeah, and then And then when he passed away, is that when Bonnie Prince Charlie comes on the scene, or was there another one in between?
There was definitely another one in between. So his son, his son James, the inverted commas, the eighth and third, as he would have been, succeeded his father in 1701, James was deposed in 1689 mainly because his son had just been born. And although people were at that time in England kind of battening down the hatches and hoping that James would just die and things would come back to what they thought of as normal without a Catholic sovereign, the birth of a Catholic son and heir really helped to precipitate James being deposed. So it was that son that succeeded to the claim in 1701, and his claim was recognized by a large number of the European powers.
And how are the English during this time, this kind of time of before 1715? How were the English treating the Scottish there? What were their what would have a person in Scotland, what would their gripes be concerning England and what they were doing to them? Maybe not necessarily on a ultra political level, but on a day-to-day, what they were facing daily from England.
Well, probably not daily, because it's an early modern state, and so the Union didn't really affect a lot of the way things in Scotland were run, especially since Scotland kept a lot of its own institutions under the terms of the Union.
Okay.
But what people tended to resent particularly was tax. So taxes rose very markedly because Scotland had been a relatively low tax economy, and England was, they were all low tax by today's standards, but England was a much higher tax economy, and there was meant to be a convergence in taxation. And so particularly for excise duty charged on wines and spirits, something like half the wines and spirits sold in Scotland seemed to have been smuggled to avoid the duty. So there was a major civil disobedience around avoiding tax, and tax was a big source of resentment. But people also resented the loss of the Parliament and the sense that Scotland no longer had an independent voice.
Well, I think that's even today, it's interesting here in America, we often talk about, or I'll say it for me, I feel like every 4 years, all we're doing is voting in our emperor king, to see who has more power than anybody in history, to see, who's going to rule, me in Arizona from Washington. And obviously that there's a, it's a bit of an exaggeration, but it definitely feels that way. And I can see people thinking, wait a sec, we're being told by these Londoners, what to do and how much money they deserve, that we, those type of things. I can see that being quite resentful.
Yeah, it was an issue then as it is now, not in exactly the same way, but you can see the similarities. It's a remote government starts asking you for a lot more money.
Yes, exactly. For the privilege of them not attacking you.
Yeah.
So what happened, that because I think the first major uprising was in 1715, is that correct?
That's right. There was an attempted uprising. Well, there was an uprising in 1689 and an attempted one in 1708, but 1715 is the first major rising. And at that stage, what was impressive was the sheer level of military support in Scotland, because it wasn't actually supported by France.
Oh, wow.
Because Louis XIV, who was very sympathetic to the Jacobites, just died, and the Regent Orleans, who wasn't nearly so sympathetic, was in power in Paris. So James didn't even know it was going to kick off as soon as it did, and but it raised round about 22,000 men in Scotland, which is virtually the 70 to 75% of the entire fencible. That's the entire number of troops that Scotland could probably raise at the time, and it represents 1 in 6 of the adult male population. And these people were not just joining up to serve in the army, they were volunteering to, or some of them were pressed, it's true, but many of them were volunteering to risk their lives to restore the Stuarts. And the motivation for doing that was very clearly put in the Commander-in-Chief, Erskine, the Earl of Mar, John Erskine, the Earl of Mar. A letter, both in his proclamations, I'll quote a letter he wrote to Colonel Spalding, asking him to accept the colonel's commission in the Jacobite army, and saying these words: "Whether the king lands or not, our aim is to march south, break the Union, and restore the dignity of Scotland." So it's very clear that the motivation for the 1715, as indeed for subsequent Jacobite risings, is very mixed. It's partly dynastic motivation, but a very large part of it is what that dynasty represents, which is the restoration of the Scottish Parliament.
Right, and that completely kind of blows up my next question, because I think some would say, well, you're just going to depose one king for another, but as you mentioned before, and as you say here, it wasn't about that. It was about the separation of the Union and giving Scotland its own independence, or a certain amount of it.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's not exactly like a modern state, but it is but it's like it's like a state. It's like many states in the early modern period where there were multiple states under one king. So it was a significant political divide, and it was also it also marked a huge difference between what Britain was rapidly becoming and what the kind of much looser confederation that the Jacobites wanted to see. And one of the arguments for federation that Witherspoon, who is, of course, one of your Scottish founding fathers, put forward in the debates in the 1770s, was that Scotland had not succeeded in having a federal or confederal system and had not retained its parliament. And it was very important that the states in the new United States had that voice for that reason. So then this political divide was really significant in the 18th century. Of course, it remains significant. But to people who think that Jacobitism was just about the dynasty, and of course there are still people like that, one has to ask why it remains so important to so many people, so symbolically important. It has such global resonance and echoes. When it comes to English history, in the Wars of the Roses, who was the claimant from the House of Lancaster and who the House of York, if you even remember or care? I mean, nobody does. Dynastic squabbles from long ago don't matter. Political ones sometimes still do, and this is a political struggle and not a dynastic one.
Oh, that's really well put. And so what happened to that first kind of major uprising in 715, and what went right, what went wrong?
Well, not a lot went right, because Mar was a politician and he got no military experience, and he was pretty incompetent in a number of ways. So he divided his army, which is not the most sensible thing to do. And one part of the army went south to attack England, and with some English Jacobite support from Northern English Catholics, and they got as far as Preston and were besieged and defeated there. Mar, with a smaller part, with a large part of the army, but with his own divided part of the army, had a drawn battle at the Battle of Sheriff Muir in 1715, where he failed to follow up his advantage and then started to lose impetus. He didn't quite know what to do next. And really, over the next few months, the rising petered out and collapsed because there was no direction behind it, no purpose, and no energy. So it was very badly led, but was actually had about half as many troops again, in fact, slightly more than those who were engaged in the rising of 1745.
Right. And what was the some of the fallout from that 1715 uprising when things fell apart? What were maybe some of the consequences for both James and also the people of Scotland?
Well, James had landed later on in the rising, and he was meant to be crowned at Scone near Perth in early 1716, but in the end wasn't. He went back to the continent. The British Crown was very keen to see James expelled not only from France but also from everywhere except the Papal States, because they wanted him. Having James in Rome was good for them in propaganda terms because it associated him very closely with the papacy. So they succeeded in doing that by exerting diplomatic pressure on France and on other powers in the years after 1715. Basically, relatively few. There were some high-profile executions, but relatively few of those who were involved in 1715 were punished, as they were risking, to the extent that they were risking, because the Duke of Argyll, who commanded the British forces in Scotland, realized how fragile the Union was and really counselled a very gentle way of dealing with it. So basically what happened was that office holders, justices of the peace, magistrates, people who with any government office who had supported the Jacobites or were thought to be sympathetic to them were purged, and people who were loyal were brought in. But most of the changes occurred like that. They didn't involve brutality.
Okay, interesting. And I ask this because obviously there's where a lot of people or a lot of the history that I've seen skips like from 1715 right to 1745, and a movement like that to last a generation basically is quite a movement. And I'm curious, how that was kept alive. And what was going on during that time in between those two kind of major rebellions or skirmishes, battles, more like.
Well, there was another. Yeah. There was another rebellion rising attempted in 1719, which involved the use of Spanish troops. A few hundred Spanish troops actually landed in Scotland. But again, bad weather, as was a frequent occurrence, bad weather prevented the reinforcement of the Jacobites, and the British government got wind of the rising early on. There was an attempted plot, which was London-based, to have a coup d'etat in 1722-23. And then there was a plan for a rising in 1744. The Jacobite cause was reinvigorated through the emergence of Charles Edward Stuart, the elder of James's two sons, who was charismatic, determined, and highly able, and made a big impact even by the late 1730s. So people
were aware of him, and
people are aware of him, absolutely, and they gravitated towards him. There are a lot of issues which perpetuated Jacobitism. One of them was that apart from Glasgow and the tobacco and West Indies trade and Chesapeake trade, only Glasgow and the west of Scotland were benefiting from that. The east of Scotland, which had strong trade relationships with continental Europe, particularly France and the Netherlands, was having a really bad time. There were also some significant problems with climatic impact from bad winters. So there's a lot of discontent being fed by economic conditions. There's no doubt about that. internationally, Jacobitism was very much to the fore in promoting the spread of Freemasonry. And Jacobite Freemasonry became a major international force in the first third of the 18th century because it was one of the key ways in which Jacobites created and sustained international networks. So and also prominent Jacobite soldiers from Scotland were achieving senior rank across the whole of Europe in the armies of the day. For example, James Francis Edward Keith was a general in the Russian army and governor of Finland, and subsequently became the field marshal commanding the armies of Frederick the Great. So there is a very strong elite diasporic culture of exiled Jacobites throughout Europe, who are distributing a lot of their networking through Freemasonic networks. And there's also a lot of disquiet and economic discontent at home in Scotland.
And I'm sure, countries like France are always looking for an opportunity to tickle the British a little bit and get under their skin or find a reason to get the get up on them, I guess.
Well, it was for most of the 18th century, from the 1740s even to the 1790s, beyond the Revolution, it was French policy to divide the British state into England, Scotland, and Ireland if it could. For a large part of the time, because the 18th century was above everything else, and that shaped the world we live in now, a life or death struggle between Great Britain and France to be the dominant power in the world. And France, not unreasonably, seeing the influence and significance that Scottish troops brought to bear, not only very early on, even in the War of the Spanish Succession before 1713, and certainly by the time of the 7 Years' War after 1756, then France particularly wanted Scotland taken out of the equation. And they not unreasonably thought that if England, Scotland, and Ireland were divided, France would win. Right.
Absolutely. Yeah. So onto the scene comes Charles Edward Stuart. And again, this is me like imposing my American view on things, but in a way, he kind of reminds me a little bit of, and I'm not making a political statement here, but he reminds me a little bit in a way of like a Donald Trump. And here's what I mean by that. He is like everybody knows who Donald Trump is. Everybody knew, his failings. And I have many, many friends who will say something to the effect of, "Oh yeah, and I don't support Trump and everything, but man, he's going to stick it to those guys in Washington." Or they'll say, Trump, he understands us, and obviously it's not in the same way, but it seems to me like as a symbol, just like Donald Trump was the symbol maybe for Red America, if you will, Charles Stuart seems to be like this symbol that people can rally around. And I'm wondering if that's if that's an analogous analogy.
Well, I know that the Atlantic's just run a piece about the in the US just run a piece about the Jacobites and Donald Trump, but it's not one I'm enormously drawn to myself.
Right.
One of the things I would say about, and this is maybe the most popular contemporary manifestation of Charles Edward Stuart's reputation, is that while appreciative of the enormous influence that the Outlander series, with its more than 30 million sales, has had on interest in Jacobitism and tourism in Scotland linked to Jacobite sites, it takes a traditionally dim view framed by generations of a certain sort of British history of Charles Edward Stuart's personality and character.
Okay.
However, Charles Edward Stuart actually does not deserve that. he has many character flaws, but as I often say to people, who point out that as he aged, he became bad-tempered and alcoholic. That if your high point of your life occurs when you're 25, and after that all you get is unemployment and the brush off, it doesn't do much for your character. Very few people could actually deal with that, and he wasn't one of them. But certainly as a young man, he had enormous abilities, and he had and appeal to people. Like all the Stuarts, he was rather slow in paying his debts, and generally speaking, viewed loans as gifts. I don't know where you'd want to take that analogy, but that was certainly something that he and Charles II, his grandfather, shared in common.
That's
great uncle, I should say, shared in common.
Right. That's great. It is pretty amazing. He's able to gather, from what I understand, quite a force, and then he runs into some terrible luck heading to Scotland, it seems as if it kind of is aborted from the beginning. This 1745 campaign.
Well, it's actually the moment where it certainly must fail is when the Jacobite army, against Charles's will, the officers demand that they retreat from Derby. Is this, first of all, until Culloden, which of course is an enormous reverse, they don't lose a battle during the entire campaign, and that's not just Preston Pans and Falkirk, but it's also Clifton and Inverurie, and and Loch Lagan and one or two other encounters. So the Jacobites look very, very well led and very difficult to defeat. And it's the moment after the successful march into England at Derby, when not having gained enough English support and also not having received confirmation that the French are in fact going to land in the south of England. The French were indeed planning to land, but one of the things that was a real problem was that the army was marching much faster than intelligence or communications of the time could deal with. So nobody actually quite knew what was happening. But the decision to retreat was critical. The point at which the Jacobite army retreated, there were approximately 1,700 men between them and London on Finchley Common. And there were two large, but indeed three, including, depending how you count it, large British armies in the field, but they were all outside London. They couldn't have reached it in time. So the critical issue really is that had they marched on from Derby, they would have reached London. Although again the force was the force was not the total force that was finally raised for Jacobites, they would have outnumbered the forces facing them by between 3 and 4 to 1, and those forces would mostly have been unofficial or lightly raised militia rather than battle-hardened men. So they would have moved into London. Whether they had taken it effectively is a different matter, and whether when they got hold of the huge reserves of credit and cash that the Great Britain commanded, whether the armies in the field who could now no longer be paid or in some cases supplied would have been able to hold together long enough to dislodge them, it's a moot point. The chances are they would have lost, but by turning back, they made it certain they would lose.
What was the reason for the retreat?
The reason for the retreat was the commanders were unnerved by the fact they'd only acquired about 1,000 English recruits in the 200 miles since they crossed the border. They didn't have confirmation that the French were going to land, And they couldn't really believe, because they didn't know, that actually that there wasn't a major military force between them and London, but there wasn't.
Wow. That's the fog of war, I suppose. That's and so and then we come into Culloden. And why was that such a really, really impactful and game changing battle?
Well, without going into huge detail of the battle, Culloden was a major Jacobite defeat, obviously the major Jacobite defeat. The thing that is unexpected about the battle, really, is that people often perceive it as men with swords fighting men with guns, and the British Army's superiority is shown as something which everyone should accept. Which rather begs the question why they'd lost, or at least best drawn, every previous encounter with the Jacobites. And the answer is, of course, the Jacobites were largely armed with muskets, and the Jacobites fired at least as many, some estimates are up to twice as many musket balls per head as the British Army did on the day. And the critical issue was that they were both outnumbered, and the British Army had much more cavalry. And so, in a sense, it was the enveloping movement of the cavalry, or which they didn't quite complete the envelopment, but the near enveloping movement of the cavalry was critical. So in a way, it's not a victory of British muskets over Jacobite broadswords, but a victory of British broadswords over Jacobite muskets, because the cavalry, of course, in that era mostly attacked with a sword.
Right.
So in a sense, Culloden's not what we think it was, but nonetheless, it's a huge Jacobite defeat. Why is it a world historic battle, despite the fact it lasted less than an hour and there were only 12 to 14,000 men involved? Well, the reason for that is because it symbolized, though people didn't see it at the time, the end of the Jacobite cause. So I'll take this twofold: what happened as a result of Culloden, and what Culloden put an end to. So first of all, what Culloden put an end to was the prospect of Jacobite victory. And let's just this is a thought experiment, but this is what a Jacobite victory might well have done. So if the Jacobites had won, the British crown would have been much more positive towards France. You would have had a situation much more like the kind of mutual acceptance of, indeed, of almost a French superiority that Charles II had accepted by the Treaty of Dover in 1670. So the British crown would be much more pro-French. That means that despite Parliament, it would have been much more difficult to borrow huge sums of money to fight France, and that probably wouldn't have happened. So the 1756-63 war would probably not have happened. And if that hadn't happened, then it's pretty likely, because the presence of Catholic France to the north was something which in Quebec and French Canada was something which really spooked independent thinking Americans in the 13 colonies. It's quite possible the American War of Independence might not have happened, because France would still have had this huge swathe of North America, and moreover, they wouldn't have been challenged by the British Empire in it. And of course, it was because they lost Canada that Napoleon agreed the Louisiana Purchase in 1803 anyway.
Right.
So in other words, if North America remained heavily French, it would have been very difficult for the United States to emerge. And if France had not spent so much money fighting the British Empire to a standstill, because it had got very inferior fiscal systems, couldn't raise as much money. It didn't have financial instruments that was effective in raising money. It didn't have advanced financial markets in the same way as Great Britain did. That was the difference. If they'd not impoverished themselves getting into that position, then they would have been able to deal much more effectively with the famines and agricultural bad harvests of the 1780s, and probably had been able to avoid the French Revolution, and therefore would also have been able to avoid the rise of Napoleon, which was a direct consequence of the revolution.
Right.
So you're beginning to see that. But if the Jacobites win, the whole world could be very different away. But
wow.
Yeah. So that's the first part of it. The second part is what happened as a result of Culloden. Well, what happened as a result of Culloden was that the British Army, first of all, carried out, particularly Cumberland was very pro carrying out atrocities, and there's a lot of evidence about that. He planned it for long before Culloden. Not everyone went along with it. In fact, some British officers went to the Scots magazine to give them evidence about the atrocities. So this isn't a whole thing for the whole British Army, but certainly Cumberland and some of his commanders were very keen on outright murder, starvation, mass deportations. So Cumberland initially sent a report in saying he hoped everything would be done in 6 weeks. 10 years later, there were still significant problems.
Wow.
And one of the reasons why that the view was finally adopted that both Scotland would not be able to raise a militia during the 7 Years' War, 1756-63, but also Scottish troops would be raised, but be raised for service overseas, was primarily to ensure that everything settled down finally. So large numbers of Scottish troops were raised, not solely, but partly by ex-Jacobites, and people were financially incentivized through big signing on fees, through the promise of land, to join the British Army, primarily in North America and the Caribbean, though in some other theatres as well. And in the end, a Scottish officer who had previously been in the French service, Captain MacDonald, who was actually now captain in the 78th Fraser's Highlanders, had joined the British Army, was able to give the password in good French, which he had, to the sentries on the heights of Quebec in 1759, and allowed the decisive British victory on the plains of Abraham.
Unbelievable.
So the Scottish troops then became a major force in the British Army and its imperial success right through the 19th century. But mainly that cultus came from those troops who were raised in order to stop Scotland being a nuisance after the last Jacobite rising.
And that brings me to another question, kind of closer to my home. There's a gentleman that and I know there's many Jacobites that came to America for different reasons. One in particular that I'm fond of is a guy by the name of Hugh Mercer, and
yes,
and it was interesting to me. His story is incredible, but the fact I could not figure out why he would fight in for the British, in the French Indian War, the War of 1756-63. Well, why would somebody who was no friend of the king, and I think he was not alone. I think there was many Jacobites that took on that put on British arms to fight the French. Is that because of this that they're talking about, or was there other reasons?
There is a huge resentment among Jacobites in Scotland who stay in Scotland or who go to British possessions abroad about France in 1745. There's a widespread view that France has let Scotland down, has let the Jacobites down, and they didn't commit enough troops. I mean, if you were going to win, and it wasn't exactly France's fault that nobody knew the French were going to land at Derby, but if you were playing to win, if you were as it were, and you didn't even know the French were going to land, and then they didn't land, and you didn't get the reinforcements you were expecting. Defeat creates all kinds of conspiracy theories anyway, but people did feel the French had let them down, and therefore they were quite likely to oppose them even 20 or 30 years later. However, if they had escaped to the continent, they were quite likely to fight for France.
Interesting.
And there are Jacobites on both sides in the 63 war, and Chevalier Johnson, who is Montcalm's aide-de-camp, was very worried about being captured by the British Army, because there's still potentially a death sentence over him for his activities in 1745. And in the end, he's captured by officers in one of the regiments that suffered worst in the Battle of Culloden. One of the British regiments suffered worst in the Battle of Culloden, but they look the other way. So you do get Jacobites fighting on both sides, and it largely depends on whether they escape to the continent or not.
That is interesting. And I have to say, I really appreciate from the presentations I heard you give your nuanced approach to Jacobitism in the sense of, a lot of times when we think of Jacobites, we think of, Highland warriors, when there was so many, different people involved in the movement, that were both Scottish and English and all around had different reasons for supporting Jacobitism.
And Irish, when much later, Roger Casement suggested to Padraig Pearse the marching song for the Irish Volunteers in 1913, he suggested Shelas Och, Young Charles, which was a direct reference to Charles Edward Stuart, and Pearse said we can't have that. But interestingly enough, that kind of discourse about the discourse of Jacobite Ireland is definitely alive in the 20th century Ireland of Irish republicanism.
Okay, and that, by the way, and that kind of gets me to. Let me ask you this first. I want to ask about we've talked about some of the repercussions, kind of big, but as far as what actually happened, did Jacobite influence? This is a question I don't really have a good answer to. Did it in any way influence the Scottish Enlightenment?
Yes, I mean the Scottish Enlightenment cuts right across it, because it's been quite fashionable to say, oh, well, the Enlightenment was opposed to the Jacobites, but it wasn't. There are plenty of Jacobites who are enlightened thinkers in Scotland, and there are plenty of non-Jacobites, but it cuts across both. One of the interesting things, though, you often get is that many of this group of people, they downplay the political differences between them. So there's a great deal of friendship, personal friendship across the political divide. It's just one of those things people don't mention, and that's partly because Scots who supported the Union in the 18th century quite often saw the Jacobites' point of view. They might not have gone along with it, but they weren't often. Some of them were really hostile, implacably hostile, but that was actually really a minority. Quite a lot of them thought, well, they've got a point, but I don't think it's really practical. I'd rather not, it's too violent, or I don't want a Catholic king, or So there's a lot of fellow feeling, and so to take, for example, what I think of as the three major Scottish economists of the 18th century, who did a huge amount to create modern economics we now understand it. John Law, who is the first developer of fiat currency, and tried to he went rather too fast, I'm afraid, but he tried to change the fiscal basis of the French state to make France great again, to coin a phrase. In the early 18th century, he was a Jacobite, and he gave large donations to the Jacobites abroad. Okay. James Stewart of Goodtrees, who created Principles of Political Economy, was the first to argue the case for a metric system, and also created what is now thought of as the national champions view of European capitalism. That is, for example, France won't allow Renault to be taken over by a foreign company. So that's the national champions thesis, was a Jacobite. But of course, Adam Smith wasn't. So, but But on the other hand, Adam Smith borrowed from both James Stewart and John Law's thinking in writing The Wealth of Nations.
Right. Yeah. He borrowed from a lot of people, I hear. But
he certainly did borrow from a lot of people, but those were perhaps Scotland's and two most innovative economic thinkers that preceded him. And in a sense, he's writing against Stuart's national champions thesis, but he doesn't acknowledge as often he doesn't acknowledge with other people too Stuart and Law's contributions.
Okay. And another, again, and I really appreciate, I appreciate your time so much. There's, these are kind of big questions and big subjects, and I am so grateful for your time. I'm also curious, the one of the great, again, I think looked at, especially in my country, travesties, is the Highland clearances and the Scottish clearances of the 19th century. And I'm wondering how Jacobitism is related to that.
Well, it's not as direct as you might think, but there are two major influences. The first is that the recruitment of large numbers of Scottish troops into the British Army in the post-Jacobite era increased because they wanted to have land. They wanted to have small holdings, increased the demand for land, and meant that more and more small holdings were created, so that a lot of the land that these people had became unsustainably small as farm. They couldn't farm it; it wouldn't work, and so that influenced them not paying the rent. And then, of course, when you're not paid the rent, you're often cleared off the land.
Right.
And the second thing was that the only game in town for a northern Scottish landlord was now not to accept any kind of man rent, any kind of military service in lieu of rent. He needed cash rents, and the cash rents were needed so that life in the new Great Britain could be sustained, because it's very embarrassing to have, 20,000, 30,000 acres of land in the north of Scotland and to turn up to London and to have, less money than a second division squire.
Right.
So you want more money. And how are you going to get money? You're going to get money by turning the land over to new uses, sheep and deer, or by raising the rents. And of course, if you raise the rents on unsustainable small farms, many of which have been created in order to supply soldiers for the British Army, then the economic system is not going to be able to take it.
Interesting. Finally, and I'm going to kind of combine, and we've touched on this a little bit, but I want to combine one more question. What does the Jacobite cause? How has that influenced our modern world? And why does a guy like me in Arizona, by the way, I haven't seen Outlander, so that's not my inspiration. But why does a guy like me or somebody who maybe is up for a lost cause? I don't know what the reason is, but what's your opinion on their influence in the modern world, and why does it still resonate today with people?
It's a very big question, of course. I think fundamentally, I'd restate what I've implied before, that it's because it's a political question, and it's not well understood. So it's, in a sense, its resonance and symbolism, and they're not just of a lost cause. And of course, it is a lost cause. I mean, it's all very much water under the bridge. But at the same time, it is also, there's something about it which is unresolved. The political status of Scotland is unresolved. Scotland's relationship to Europe is unresolved. The Unionists of Northern Ireland still cling to the date 1690, the defeat of the Jacobite army by William of Orange's forces at the Boyne, as an issue which defines their identity. Ireland is divided because of the Jacobite cause to this day. So it is really about modern politics, and it has. And I think that although Outlander and many other things have helped bring the Jacobites, who have always been popular, to almost a fever pitch of interest in many parts of particularly the Anglophone world today. One of the things that has definitely also done it is Brexit, because the Jacobites, or the Jacobite cause, was always about a close relationship with Europe. It's a European movement. It involves very close, particularly Scottish and Irish links and integration with Europe. And in a sense, those old ideas have got a new political playground. Well, it's not really a playground, but political environment to be in. So the idea of taking back control that the British government and the Leave campaign prioritised in 2016 is based on the fact that Parliament should be completely sovereign and not have to give in to a European law at any point. But the idea that Parliament is completely sovereign is a claim Parliament first made in the aftermath of deposing James II and VII. Right. It is, in fact, the historic claim on which the defeat of Jacobitism rests. And so you can see that these issues simply haven't gone away.
That is absolutely fascinating. If somebody is listening to this and they want to learn more about Jacobitism or Scottish history, what would you consider good resources for somebody to find and look up, and where would they find some resources that they can learn about this stuff?
Well, if you're talking about books, then some of the books that are really useful are Daniel Secchi's The Jacobites, and his surname is Szecchi. Daniel Secchi, The Jacobites. Daniel Secchi, 1715. So that's the best single book on the 1715 rising. My own Culloden and the Myth of the Jacobite Clans, and you can also catch up with me on YouTube by searching for me on YouTube. There's quite a bit there. Frank McLean's Charles Edward Stuart, which is still the best one-volume biography, published about 30 years ago, and really gives you a sense of Charles Edward and his significance. Those are, and also Eamon O'Kearda, Ireland and the Jacobite Cause, which came out in 2002. So those are all places to start. But there's a range of really good material out there, and some of the some of the new material coming out on the Jacobites in the Caribbean and the Jacobites and piracy is extremely interesting as well. And they're in other words, there are huge areas which we haven't even touched on. But
I was going to say that's
it's ultimately a Jacobite story.
Yeah, I mean with the smuggling and everything. there is a ton of things. And then again, I would love to have you on again, because I would really like to also talk a little bit more about the Jacobite influence on America and things like that, because I think there's a lot there that we haven't covered. I again want to thank you. Tell me one more time, when is your new book coming out, and the British in Scotland, British Army in Scotland. I'm sorry, what was the title again?
It's provisionally the British Army in Scotland, 1746 to 66. So that's going to be, I have to say, the Global History of Scotland from Yale will be out first. That book on the British Army in Scotland will take some time, because there's, as I said, there's a huge amount before this podcast started. There's a huge amount of documentation, and there's nothing written on it. And you also have to get it right, because it's still sensitive stuff. But interestingly, I've already got some really good stories out of that. And, it's actually been quite interesting to share that with the National Army Museum and the Royal Scots Regiment in the UK. And it's interesting to find out that's actually, although it's controversial, the audiences from the British Army are very interested in hearing about it.
That's fabulous. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for your time. I am incredibly grateful that you took the time to talk to us and give us a great primer on Jacobitism and its philosophy and history. So, Professor Pittock, thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much, Mike Levitt, and it's a real pleasure to have had the chance to talk to you this afternoon. And if you could just send over just a little portion of your Arizona weather you don't want to Scotland, that would be much appreciated.
Well, I'll say I was up at 5 o'clock this morning getting ready for this podcast, and it was already 90 degrees. So.
Yeah, well, I'll have some of that. Thank you very much.
Send it over. Well, again, have a marvelous day. Thank you very much, and let's do this again sometime, please.
Yeah, that would be great. But pleasure talking to you, Mike.
Wonderful.
Speak soon.
You've been listening to Professor Murray Pittock. My name is Mike Levitt, and you've been listening to And If Love Remains.